Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right, good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Amy Weishart. I'm the director here at the library. Just started here a couple of months ago. It's great to see you all. We do have a few people on Zoom as well, and we'll be recording the talk tonight. We'll make it available on our website after tonight. So thank you for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Peter Rogers, who is on our board, and he will be introducing Margie. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Welcome as our new director. So happy to have you. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce Margie Patlak, today's speaker. Margie divides her time between Philadelphia and Coast, Maine, on the eastern side of the Coast Peninsula, which makes us almost neighbors. The book Margie will be presenting is More Than Meets the Eye, Exploring Nature and Loss on the Coast of Maine. The setting is primarily Maine and describes her lifelong love affair with its scenery, its plant and animal life, its weather, and its ability to teach us life lessons while expanding our consciousness of our natural environment. Margie has a degree in botany and environmental studies, and this educational background is certainly evident in her detailed descriptions and explanations of her lifelong Maine experience. She's written over 200 articles about the environment, neuroscience, biomedical research, and technology for such popular publications as Discover Magazine, The Washington Post, The Los Angeles Times, The Philadelphia Inquirer, and many others. Much in this book resonates for me. We have both spread ashes of loved ones in Maine waters. Margie lost her brother to ALS, and I lost my stepfather to the same disease. She describes fog as an opportunity, with which I heartily concur. And her deft treatment in layperson language of topics ranging from clouds to winter animal tracks to stargazing to bird navigation gave me just enough information, but not too much to feel somewhat informed. More Than Meets the Eye was recently awarded Outstanding Book of 2021 by the American Society of Journalists and Authors in the memoir category. The judges of the award noted that the writing was strong and in clear and often poetic language. Words were well chosen and moving, placing the reader in the middle of the journey. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Margie.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that great detailed introduction. It's a hard act to follow. And thank you, Amy, for inviting me to speak here tonight. What I'm going to do is share with you the lessons that the nature of Maine has taught me about the nature of life and renewal and what remains once the ashes are spread. I found these to be inspiring lessons that complemented my scientific studies of the nature of Maine. And I think they're particularly relevant today, now that the pandemic, unfortunately, has made many of us wrestle with loss, whether it be loss of a loved one or loss of just life the way we knew it. And it's also relevant because the pandemic has prompted many of us to spend more time outdoors in nature where we feel safer and perhaps comforted, and be curious about the nature around us. So what can nature teach us about the nature of life? I'm going to answer that in a roundabout fashion by first telling you how I came to write More Than Meets the Eye and how it came to be much more than I originally intended it to be. And I'll read you a few excerpts from my book. And then I'm going to switch to what I call a visual tour of the book with my photos of the scenery that I describe in the book. And of course, there'll be time for any questions or comments you have, because I feel like that's an important part of these sorts of presentations. The whole time I was writing it, I felt like I was having a one-sided conversation with myself. So it's wonderful that you're here to complete the other half of the conversation. Okay, so I started writing More Than Meets the Eye more than 10 years ago when my husband and I bought a place on the Coast Peninsula in the upper reaches of what is affectionately known as Down East Maine. And prior to that time, We did the usual progression that people who end up owning a short home in the summer here do, which is to go from tenting to renting to buying. And the reason why we wound up in Maine was really my fault, because I had so many fond childhood memories of spending summers on Mount Desert Island while my dad worked at the biology lab there. So Maine kind of got into my blood, and I always yearned for the wilder world that I experienced in Maine. So, you know, most people in my area where I grew up wanted to go to the Jersey Shore. Well, I wanted to go to the shore that had rocks. And I wanted the forest to be vast and filled with all these wild creatures that pop out and surprise you. And I wanted to swim in the expansiveness of the bay and not be limited to a lap lane. So even though I grew up in a DC suburb and I was raised my family in a Philadelphia suburb, I always wanted to return to Maine. So needless to say, when we finally did it, I was thrilled. And I was very eager to learn more about my new environment. I've always been kind of a perpetually curious person. So I had lots of questions like, I keep seeing these big puffy clouds over the bay, but they don't rain on us. Why is that? And where do the animals in Maine go in the wintertime? And if they stick around, how do they survive the cold? And they say that there are lots of moose in these forests and they're supposed to be so darn big. How come I never see them? So I find, you know, personally that the best way for me to learn something new is to research and write about it. So I started devoting a portion of my time spent in Maine to researching and writing about my new environment. So I wrote about, for example, the biology of my new neighbors, the moose and the porcupines and the foxes. And I wrote about the geological forces that thrust up those mountains in Acadia and gave us our beautiful blueberry barrens and bogs. And I wrote about the astronomical forces that gave us such dramatic tides and lots of other stuff. To give you a taste of some of that early writing, I'm going to read to you from my chapter, Unseen Worlds, just a portion of it. So Unseen Worlds is a chapter that's mostly about what the various lenses like telescopes and microscopes and binoculars can reveal that you previously didn't see before, and how it connects you to a greater realm than what you could see with the naked eye. But the section I'm going to read to you tonight is the portion that is about an amazing guide-led bioluminescent kayak that we did in Castine, Maine. Okay. Karen, our tour guide for our night kayak ride in Castine, Maine, is a fit woman with the long black French braid just starting to go gray. While we sign release forms in her cedar shack office, she enchants us with luminous tales. One time I went swimming at night and each step into the water created saucers of light around my feet, she tells Frank and me, another couple and two young women. Just the movement of your paddle in the water will create sparks. Sparks in water? Surely fire cannot exist within water. She explains that many dinoflagellates, those ovoid creatures with tails zipping around under my microscope like circus clowns, have an enzyme that makes a phosphorescent glow. It is the same enzyme that makes fireflies light up. Karen tells us you can see a lot of bioluminescence in the nutrient-rich portions of the bay in Castine we'll be exploring, but it's also common in most oceans and bays. Of course, it changes day to day. Sometimes we see lots of bioluminescence and some nights we don't see much of anything, Karen says. We walk over to the dock where she outfits each double and single kayak we're about to use with a tiny red light, equips us with life jackets, a whistle, and paddle, and explains how to maneuver the kayak and what to do if it capsizes. By the time Frank and I enter our double kayak, the sun has set and a few stars and the planet Venus start to surface in the sky. We set out of the harbor, dodging pleasure boats anchored in the water. The bay is so calm, it mirrors the stars emerging in the sky above, enveloping us in a sparkling vastness. Once away from the lights on the dock, it becomes so dark that only the rough outlines of the other double kayaks and the red lights that dot their helms can be seen. But we can hear Karen, who maintains the banter to reassure us. I've had lots of scientists go on this kayak tour, including a marine biologist who told me nobody really knows why there's bioluminescence in the ocean. They all have their theories. Some say the plankton do it to startle their predators, to make visible the bigger critters trying to eat them, who will then be seen and eaten by even bigger fish. But no one really knows. The water is calm and there is a still coolness in the air that makes me thankful I wore my sweatshirt. Frank and I continue to paddle, but no sparks emerge. Could we be kayaking on one of those nights when the bioluminescence is bland? One time I had a Mars geologist, Karen continues. He's one of those guys who controls the exploring robot on Mars. This reminds me of the oceanographer Robert Ballard, who discovered the sunken Titanic and once commented that half of the United States lies underwater, but we have better maps on Mars than we do of the underwater real estate in our own country. Another oceanographer, Sylvia Earle, pleads that we do more exploring of the ocean, 95% of which we have yet to see, which is surprising given that nearly all of the living space in our planet is in the ocean. According to marine biologist Edith Witter. She also pointed out that it's not just microscopic plankton, but most animals in the sea that emit light. Consequently, the ocean is a magical place filled with breathtaking light shows and bizarre and wondrous creatures, alien life forms that you don't have to travel to another planet to see, she said in a TED Talk. There is no moon, and we're traveling at a steady clip despite the fact that it is pitch black. I can't see the other kayakers, just their tiny red boat lights. These lights on Karen's kayak keep us on course, as well as her instructions. She guides us to a narrow stretch of the bay where the phosphorescent plankton is supposed to be especially prevalent. But her general directions do little to calm my nervousness due to night blindness. Keep to the left here, or you might hit a rock, she calls out, and Frank adjusts his steering, narrowly missing a boulder, making me shudder. Be careful, the bay is shallow here because of a sandbar, she says a little later, and I imagine us getting stuck. How can you be careful when you can't see anything? But then I see them. Lighting the commotion of our motion, sparks swirl off our paddles like dozens of shooting stars. I put my hand into the water and catch a few of the dancing lights. Oh, wow, I said, I didn't expect them to be so big. Yeah, they clump together, Karen says, maybe because of the silt in the water. And if you see larger circles of light, they're probably copepods, tiny bioluminescent crustaceans. The fish that eat them collect their light in their gills, and then they start to glow. I stop paddling and put my hand in the water as Frank continues to propel us forward. Each finger sends off a stream of sparkles akin to the glitter given off by Tinkerbell flying or the good witch of the North's magic wand. We have been transported to another world. It's as if they wanted to lure the enchanted observer into a realm of fairies. One person wrote about his encounter with phosphorescent creatures in the sea in a letter from 1853. I certainly am enchanted and back paddled to splash harder and spark more of those fireflies of the sea. But Frank starts to complain that I'm slowing us down and we're too far behind the group. So I compromise, submerging a few fingers, mesmerized by the trail of light that follows them. We catch up with Karen, who guides us back to the pier. It's quiet and dark, except for a bar called Dennett's. After we pull the kayaks up onto the dock and before returning our equipment, Karen asks us for feedback. So what do you think, guys? Was it what you expected? It was more than I expected, I say, and one of the young women adds, we saw things out there most people will never see. I know what you mean, Karen responded. One night, I was the only one out kayaking the bay. Not only were there lots of stars and bioluminescence, but the northern lights were dancing across the sky. But everyone was drinking inside Dennis' bar and missed it all. I wanted to shout to them, come out and see this, guys. You're missing the greatest show on earth. A few days after the kayak tour, I tell my friend Art about our astonishing encounter with bioluminescent plankton. Art is a lobsterman who fishes in our bay for much of the year. Oh yeah, I see those sparks in the water every time I oar back from my boat if it's late and it's already dark. I see it all the time. He sees it all the time in our bay. What else am I missing? So you can see how humbled I was by everything I had to learn about the nature in Maine, and also how awestruck I was by everything I encountered. Okay, so I continued to do these writings about nature in Maine, and I noticed something peculiar was happening, which was that my family kept on popping up into my essays. You know, my brother, my mother, my father, even my parents and my grandparents, they kind of showed up like unexpected guests at the doorstep. And for example, I'd be writing about the 3 generations of monarch butterflies that it takes for them to travel from their wintering ground in Mexico to their summering ground in Maine. And that would morph into me writing about the migration of my own family and what was passed on from generation to generation. Or I'd be writing about the dramatic tides that we experience in Maine and how they shape our daily activities. And then the next thing I know, I'd be writing about how ephemeral life is and the especially ephemeral nature of raising my son, Jake. So I thought this was strange, and I didn't really understand what was going on until I was back in Philadelphia. There I was part of a writers group, and the leader of that writers group, who had been reading everything I had written so far, said, well, why don't you pull together these writings and turn them into a book? And she said, to get a better sense of what that book might be about, why don't you write an introduction? So I did that, and that introduction became the prologue of my book, and it totally surprised me. So I'm going to read that to you now, and I think you'll see why I was so surprised. The seals swim out to meet my mother. We are gathered on the weathered gray dock of a rented Maine house, a simple cedar log cabin surrounded by forest, much like many of the cottages we stayed in the summer while my father worked at a nearby biology research lab. Sunlight glints on the water, and a cool breeze wafts the distinctive aroma of the rocky coast, a pungent combination of the earthy spiciness of fir, pine, and spruce trees, and the fishy smells of seaweed, mussels, and cobbles soaked in brine. Although my mother grew up in an apartment building in Chicago and lived most of her life tied to the asphalt of various cities, she always loved the summers we spent on the sparsely populated Mount Desert Island in Maine. She took us blueberry picking on the boulder-strewn hill near the lab, frog hunting at the local pond, and clam digging at the bay at low tide. My mom loved looking out at all the beauty by the water, the bay framed by wind-sculpted silhouettes of trees like those in Japanese paintings, the gossamer fog at sunrise, the rosy hues of the sky reflected in the water as the sun sank. So we thought it only appropriate to scatter my mother's remains in the Gulf of Maine. Gulls scatter in all directions, crying in protest at our arrival at the dock, and a kingfisher rattles away, flying off his pine perch. On a distant rock outcropping, a cormorant stretches out its large black wings like a coke. Reflected clouds drift through water dotted with the bobbing buoys of lobster traps. Overshadowed by the looming mountains behind us, our family huddles on the creaking wooden platform, dwarfed by the backdrop of the expansive blue bay. Both my balding brother and elderly father rest heavily on their canes, while I take a folded piece of paper out of my jeans pocket and quote from a condolence letter Albert Einstein wrote to the widow of a friend. In quitting this strange world, he has once again preceded me by just a little, I say, wondering if Einstein's notion that time is an endless loop with no distinctions between past, present, and future resonates with my gray-bearded brother and father, both of whom have degrees in physics. A pair of loons responds with sonorous laments. I try to make eye contact with my brother's 2 grown sons, but they are gazing at the splintered gray boards under their feet. My father is dry-eyed, but my 12-year-old daughter starts to sniffle. My oldest child, Jake, and my brother's oldest son, Johan, both gangly, slip into kayaks tethered to the dock. After we untie their ropes and give each son a paddle, my brother's wife hands Johan the small cardboard box of ashes, and he plies the glassy water, Jake paddling his kayak in parallel. Oops. My husband, Frank, puts his arm around my slumped shoulders, and we watch as my mother's grandsons, boys that had become men while she entered her final years, put away their paddles and together shake out flecks of her bone and ash. How could my mother, whose caramel eyes reflected delight in my every achievement and whose angry outbursts made me cower in my bedroom, be reduced to that small package of dust? While the gray powder falls into the water, it sinks in that I am truly a motherless child. But I wrestle with that biblical notion of ashes to ashes. Surely something remains. While the last bits of my mother slip into the sea, a few curious seals swim over to see what is falling into their waters. A beautiful swirling dance ensues as their swimming heads engrave the calm water with V's that eventually merge with the kayak's wake. It is entrancing, and though I do not feel my mother is embodied in her ashes, there's something comforting about her being welcomed by these tidal dwellers and returned to Maine in the primordial sea. 2 years later, it is the ash remains of my brother's 55-year-old body that are spread on a mountain in Vermont. He was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, also called ALS, the week my mom died. Just a few months after we gathered in Maine, my brother became confined to a wheelchair and quickly lost the ability to move most of his body. From the moment my mother was diagnosed with metastatic cancer to the time my father died 10 years later, death lapped at the edges of my family like an incoming tide that quickly submerges the small islands it encounters. Propelled in part by my brother's death and a deepened awareness that life can be short, Frank and I decided to make the most of our remaining lives. We took the plunge and used proceeds from the sale of Frank's business in Philadelphia to buy a 5-acre slice of a northern Maine forest and bay with the cedar, mahogany, and glass Frank Lloyd Wright-ish house my mother would have loved. We started spending summers there, and after our daughter went off to college, falls as well. Frank always had that business instinct of buying low and selling high, and saw having such a house on the coast of Maine as a good investment. I saw it as an emotional lifesaver. So I think you can see why I was so surprised. Here I thought I was writing a book about the nature of Maine, and now, you know, it was morphing into more than that, because by asking such questions like what remains once the ashes are spreading, I was venturing into spiritual territory that no amount of scientific research could help me write about. So I was really writing about what the nature of Maine was teaching me about the nature of life. And so at that point, I decided to kind of view everything else I was experiencing from then on in with both a spiritual and a scientific lens. And I think the two actually complement each other quite well. It was also at that point that I decided to polish and publish what I had written and turn it into a book, because I realized that the lessons I was learning from nature that were helping me heal from my losses might be beneficial to other people who were dealing with some sort of loss. So now I'm going to read to you from my section, Matriarchs and Monarchs, which is about a lesson on life that a monarch butterfly taught me. I gotta find it. Okay. It is a summer of butterflies. Colorful fluttering is everywhere. A gathering of blossoms in my garden provides an enticing oasis of nectar in the midst of a forest clearing. Flowers of all shapes and colors line a pink granite path leading from the house down to the rocky Maine shore. The beckoning purple and magenta spires of lupins and butterfly bush that abut the stone steps to the water have the blue bay as their backdrop. Scattered pines, spruces, and firs edge the cobbled beach and tower above the grassy yard, echoing their forms. But all I can see are butterflies. The startling indigo eye spot on the taupe wing of a buckeye butterfly stares at me while it drinks. Nearby, a series of orange fritillaries speckled with brown line up on a flowering stalk like a regiment, each on its own pink perch of flora. If I get too close, they twirl away, chasing each other up into the sky. Nothing seems to disturb the red admiral butterflies that spiral around lavender veronica spikes, probing each floret with their straw-like tongues. Their open wings are black cloaks edged in vermilion, a few white splotches on their upper flaps. But the most familiar is the most enchanting, the monarch. Monarchs sail in to sip from yellow coreopsis flowers, their wings like stained glass windows in a cathedral, each orange segment outlined in black. Are they part of the herd of monarchs that migrate all the way from Maine down to Mexico? Or are they allowed only one brief hop in a series of hops that takes their species in the reverse direction from Mexico to Canada? It takes 3 to 4 generations of monarchs to make this journey of more than 2,000 miles. Each butterfly lives about 2 months and travels only part of the way before laying eggs on butterfly weed and other milkweed species. These eggs enable the next generation of butterflies to carry on the trek north. The final generation that makes the return flight to Mexico can live as long as 9 months. As Carl Safina noted in his book, The View from Lazy Point, this raises questions much bigger than the butterflies themselves. How do they know what generation they're from and what they're supposed to do? Each hopscotching generation of monarchs has the same genetic blueprint, so different genes can't solely explain why the northbound butterflies live only a few months, while the southbound live several seasons. Scientists suspect that certain light lengths and temperatures might alter the activity of specific migratory genes in the monarch to cause the differences in generations. But still a mystery is how the monarch butterfly, over a span of so many generations, knows to return each year to the same forested slope in Mexico to winter, the equivalent of long dead great-grandparents dictating where their great-grandchildren should spend their winters. My long dead great-grandparents were Jews in Tsarist Russia who were restricted to villages known as shtetls. They left Russia to avoid having their 12-year-old sons conscripted into the army, their daughters raped during the carnage of pogroms. As a child, I overheard the starving shards of stories about the old country. Such sorrows we had there, so many pogroms. I was a baby during one, and my mother hid me in a dresser drawer, my grandmother told my mother, as they ate slices of her still warm apple cake, and I did homework nearby. Another time, my father was coming home from work when someone just started shooting at him. Thanks God he was able to hide behind some trash cans. Like the monarchs who hopscotch their way across the globe to find better opportunities, at the turn of the 20th century, my great-grandmother and her family packed a few belongings and embarked on a voyage to England and then to America, where 50 years later I would meet her, a tiny, bent-over old woman in Chicago who always wore a babushka from which only her nose protruded and the rest of her face sunken into wrinkles. We called her the old Bubby, and my parents would prod me to come close to her so she could hug me. I shrank back from this shriveled up woman who was witches in my picture books. The monarchs I'm seeing on the move are probably north of my garden. Shortly after they arrive, I spot the telltale bright yellow, black, and white stripes of monarch caterpillars contrasting like crosswalk markings with the green leaves of the butterfly weed plants they eat. Monarch caterpillars take only 4 days to hatch from eggs, and when I first discover them, they're as tiny as a thumbnail. But after a few days of continually devouring leaves, they grow to be as long as a thumb. Eager to see what happens next, I pluck one of the fatter and longer caterpillars from the butterfly weed and put it in a glass jar, replacing its metal lid with a paper towel perforated by a fork. I add some butterfly weed leaves, which disappear each day into the caterpillar's mouth. My daughter asked me if we might be harming the caterpillar by holding it captive. Will we disrupt its natural passage into a butterfly? I explained to Eva that as long as we keep the caterpillar supplied with the leaves it has evolved to feed on, we won't stop it from unfolding into a butterfly any more than we could stop a woman in labor from giving birth. A few nights later, the caterpillar stops eating, and before going to sleep, I notice the caterpillar has climbed to the top of the jar where it hangs motionless from the paper towel lid. The lower end of its body curves so it resembles the letter J. Checking the following morning, I discover no caterpillar but a chrysalis, a surprisingly smooth chartreuse pendant dangling at the top of the jar from what was recently the last pair of its black legs, with a striking bracelet of gold edged with black encircling its conical top. Promise me you'll take the candlesticks, my mother said the day she stopped eating Her pale face, framed by a short crop white hair, was gaunt from the cancer consuming her, revealing high cheekbones that had been hidden for years and sinking her large contemplative eyes into a skeletal frame. I told the old bubby I would pass them on to you. My great-grandmother had brought those silver candlesticks from Russia, and I always admired their ornate swirls of etched leaves, emblems of the earth that grounded these objects of piety into nature. Once used to beckon the Sabbath into the old bubby's home, the light from these candlesticks eventually had welcomed major Jewish holidays into our own household. I reassured my mother I would take the candlesticks and even promised her I would have Eva polish them like I once did before every Passover. A few days later, my brother closed our mother's eyes for the last time and wept, his shoulders heaving. The workers from the funeral home came and carelessly carted her away, cocooned in a black body bag, leaving behind a profound emptiness. I brought the candlesticks home that night and wrote my mother's eulogy, marking her passage by noting each important step she took. Attending college in the 40s and marrying my father, having 2 children in the 50s, teaching at Head Start in the 60s, going to grad school during the 70s, and starting a psychotherapy practice during the 80s. It was a full life, but she wasn't ready for it to be over. Look at all those books I'll never get to read, she said shortly before she died, pointing to a stack next to her bed. Maybe you'll want to read them after I'm gone. Once my mother died, the limits of her life, of all our lives, became apparent. Each of us carries out a mere step or two that moves our family forward in time. My great-grandparents took a big leap by coming to this country and then worked long hours as a tailor and homemaker so that their son could become a doctor and their daughter, my grandmother, could live a much more secure and comfortable life than the one she left behind in Russia. It's not just candlesticks that get passed from one generation to another. My mother handed off her gift of life with all its unfinished business and imperfections to me, and I will in turn hand off the same gift to Eva. There's just so much each of us can accomplish in a lifetime. But the seemingly impossible becomes possible when all the generations are strung together, each of us playing a humble role in a magnificently evolving lifeline. The monarch knows this instinctively. Yeah, I have to mention that I gave this talk to the Camden Public Library solely by Zoom. So I was back in Philadelphia when I gave it, and I was sitting at my dining room table, and on the sideboard behind me were the candlesticks that I described in the essay. And right when I got to that passage, it was sort of like the end of the day. And right when I got to that passage where I said that my mother asked me to take the candlesticks, a beam of light shot through the window and spotlighted the candlesticks. And everybody was in the chat room going, look, look, look. And I had no idea what was happening. It was sort of a magical moment. As a librarian said, it seemed like your mother was with us at that moment. So that was kind of amazing. Well, I can read on, I usually also read from my chapter, Tugged by the Tides, which, I mean, this last chapter answers the question, what remains once the ashes have been spread, and goes into more depth. The Tugged by the Tides chapter answers the question, what remains once a child grows up and leaves home. But it's warm tonight, and I don't know if you, no, you're up for it, everybody? Okay, I'll read from that chapter too then. You know, the librarian, after I gave this talk, she said, yeah, your talk was great, the way it spanned the generations, and, you know, from, you know, you dealing with all different age groups. And I said, well, that's what happens when you're old, when you write a book. Okay. The powerful pull of the moon is especially apparent on the Maine shore, where it creates 13-foot tides that routinely fill in empty bays and determine daily rhythms of activity. On my cobbled U-shaped bay, the underwater real estate opens up twice each day, revealing denizens with just a few hours to make the most of their temporary stay on land. Some scurry about like tourists released from a cruise ship. One adventuresome crab, venturing sideways as far as the ledge that abuts the bay, was surprised to encounter a landlubber in an Adirondack chair. Snails hunker down in their shells or roam in tidal pools where they are shielded from the dry air until the sea washes them again. Snails and crabs aren't the only ones exposed to the tug of the moon at low tide. It also creates ephemeral pathways to teardrop islands in the distant sea. At a local beach at high tide, a wide swath of ocean separates you from one of these tiny islands, which beckons with its outcroppings topped with the jagged jades of conifers. But if you're fortunate to be there close to low tide, within minutes, a triangle of pebbles, periwinkles, and cobbles suddenly appears next to the linear shore and points to the distant island. Like Moses' parting of the Red Sea, this arrow of emerging land quickly spreads wider and longer until it forms a crunchy barnacle-lined passageway to the previously inaccessible Bar Island. At this point and no later, you must walk this bridge of stones to explore the island because after a mere hour, the sea will seep in and surround it again. If deaf to the ticking of the tidal clock, I miss the limited time there is to climb Bar Island's basalt boulders, which resemble beached whales, and admire its driftwood sculptures and trees shaped by the wind. After biking the sinuous road to the entrance of the forested beach path, gingerly walking weathered boards over the boggy ground leading to the cobbled shore, and finally broaching the sweet-scented wild rose bushes edging the beach, I often discover the ephemeral land bridge to Bar Island has vanished underwater. The tide has turned. It's not just on the main shore that time passes quickly. Time especially speeds up when you have small children. Don't blink or you might miss him growing up, people would tell me when they saw me chasing after Jake when he was small. But I was too busy addressing the ever-present and pressing demands of a small person, a diaper change, an earache requiring a doctor's visit, a trek to the park so Jake, like a dog, could run off his boundless energy and satisfy his need to explore. I didn't realize that my amazement in seeing my son take his first wobbly steps away from me would evolve so soon into wistfulness when he later walked much further into his own life on other coasts and continents. I tried to slow down and savor the world as seen through Jake's eyes. His magical thinking that a new pair of sneakers would make him run faster. His imagination turning shadows into roaming monsters and sticks into swords that cut them down. His delight in the ordinary, a bobbing balloon or a chirping cricket would bring him so much pleasure. Especially enjoyable was Jake's insatiable curiosity that led him to turn over dead logs in the forest to see creatures crawling beneath, or that prompted him to scamper from one tidal pool to another, looking for suckered starfish. But more often, I was muddled by the mundane, writing articles, making meals, tackling mounds of laundry, walking the aisles of the grocery store, filling out endless school forms, or tending Jake's youngest sister. There is not enough time to enter his wondrous world, except for a few notable milestones, such as riding a bike, driving a car, or graduating high school. Jake grew up without me fully noticing. One minute he was pleading, "Carry me," as we walked up the large hill between the library and home. And the next minute, he was navigating the Tokyo subway system on his own. The tide had turned. The quintessential tale about the tides is that of Viking King Canute, who was raised on the shores of the North Sea that surround Denmark. Canute went on to not only rule his native country, but also Norway and England. Legend has it that Canute's courtiers came to admire his power so much that they claimed he also had the power to command the tides of the sea to retreat. But Canute knew to be humble before the sea that cradled him, to show all that even a king's power is worthless compared to the forces of nature. Canute had his throne carried to the seashore and sat on it as its tide came in, commanding the waves to come no further. Of course, the waves splashed closer and closer, sending up sea spray. When water swirled around the legs of his throne, Canute supposedly said, "See, there is no king worthy of the name of God, whom heaven, earth, and sea obey." Canute knew that the tides are a rhythmic force of nature that cannot bend to the whims of a man, even if that man wears a crown on his head. A king cannot stop the swelling of a tide, just like a mother cannot stop her son from growing up. The constantly changing tides were also an eye-opener to me when I started spending summers in Maine. To go swimming or kayaking, I have to stop working at high tide. To collect sea glass or explore the islands, I need to close my computer at low tide. Like King Canute, I am ruled by the immense uncontrollable power of the tides, and I try to match my rhythms of work and play with the ebb and flow of the water that follows the moon. This way of marking time makes me more aware of time passing and the need to make the most of every moment. Yet I also recognize that the tides won't care whether I make it to the islands or to the celery-colored grasses of the marshes. They will come and go, spread out and suck in, keeping the planetary breathing rhythm, the endless time clock, for as the poet Mary Oliver noted, in water that departs forever and forever returns, we experience eternity. Nature will go on without me, which is somehow comforting. The phone rings and I hear the deep voice of my son, who has gone on without me to live far away on another coast. Many moons have ushered him into adulthood, but Jake hasn't lost his childlike curiosity about the world around him and tries to make the most of his temporary stays wherever his job takes him, exploring each location like a zealous crab running about the main shore at low tide. When he moved to California and close to deserts emptied of city lights, Jake bought a telescope and became especially attuned to the moon's rhythms, purposely timing moon and stargazing trips to the lunar cycle. Now deep into his 20s, Jake follows not only our moon, but the moons of Jupiter and other nearby planets with his telescope. Although I wish he were here exploring the shore with me, I enjoy seeing the other worlds through Jake's eyes. A friend related to me with some distress that adult children were like wandering pieces of yourself over which you have no control. As I told Jake when he was in high school, worrying about his welfare was part of my job description as a mom, and explained why I couldn't sleep well at night until after I heard his key turn in the lock of the front door. But I have learned to go over the years we've spent apart to appreciate Jake's adventuresome nature, which led him to visit more than a dozen countries and return with tales of spinning Sufis, Egyptian pyramids, Somali pirates, and almost freezing to death in a hut in the mountains of Croatia. And I've come to accept the temporary nature of the years he spent living with us, recognizing his childhood was borrowed time. For as the Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran pointed out in The Prophet, your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. He stressed that the souls of visit not even in your dreams. So parents must view themselves merely as the bows from which your children, as living arrows, are sent forth. Like the perpetual tides, my children will live on without me, will sow our lineage far into the future, which somehow is comforting. A rabbi told me that mothers are closest to their children when they are newborns and recently separated from these beings that once were a part of them. Not used to this separation, mothers still see their babies as extensions of themselves, and perhaps this explains in part their intense protectiveness. But there is also something to be gained in the ebbing of the parental pull that occurs as your child grows. The essence of a son or daughter can be seen only at a distance. When viewed too close, it becomes obscured like a pointillist painting. The moon was awesome the other night, my son tells me on the phone, describing all the craters he could see with the aid of the powerful lenses of his telescope. I know, I said, looking out my windows at a bay emptied of water pulled by the full moon. I know. Somebody recently introduced me to a term that I never heard before called a parentectomy. That's what you have to do when your children grow up, I guess. So the last chapter of my book is, I'm not going to read to you from it, but it's called Fall Migrations, and it's about the amazing fall migration of the birds and the dragonflies, and I contrast that with my own impending migration south to Philadelphia. And it's in that chapter that I sum up all that I've learned from my sojourns in Maine and summarize my spiritual philosophy that is so rooted in nature and help me heal from my losses. But rather than read to you from that, I'm just going to hope you're going to get the book and read it yourself. So the book is available in this library and many other libraries in Maine and other places. And you can also, it's in many bookstores, like if you go to Sherman's bookstore in Bar Harbor or something. And you can also order it online at bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores, or amazon.com and barnesandnoble.com, which doesn't. If you can't find it in a bookstore or a library, they can always order it for you. And now I'm going to switch to doing a visual tour of the book. So I'm going to move over here. Do you need to reposition that? Or... These are my photos. I should mention that I'm in June of 2023, Down East Books, who published this book, is publishing a book of my Maine nature photos called Wild and Wondrous: Nature's Artistry on the Coast of Maine. And I just grabbed a few that show the scenery that I described in the book. So I think starting with this one, which is taken from the top of, I think, Penobscot Mountain in Acadia, it just speaks to the amazing, unique geography we have in Maine with the mountains and the forests and the ocean. So in such close proximity. And I'm trying to make it go forward, but it won't. Oh, that's right. I had to go backwards. Yeah, I forgot about that. Okay, and this just shows an example of how vast the forests are. Maine is 90% forested. This is Raven's Nest in the Scoodic Peninsula of the Acadian part of Maine. And once again, it speaks to how close the forests and the cliffs and the water are, and how beautiful. And here's a porcupine walking down the road in my development. I have one chapter called Out of Eden, which is about my perennial battle with the porcupines who eat all my flowers in my garden. But we love them. And I also have a chapter called Out Fox, which is about an encounter I made with this fox in particular, and what she taught me about the infirmaments you get as you age. This is a series of slides that I want to show you to illustrate the tides in my bay. So this is at a relatively high tide, and you see as I progress, if you keep your eyes on those two stones, how it keeps going out. And it's remarkable. As I said to my husband after we bought our property, we've got two landscapes for the price of one. So this is taken at low tide, and that's my house in the background, buried in woods. And the reason why I climbed over all that slippery seaweed is so I could take a picture of this. Which is the fog and coming in the rain. And here's our kayak going through the nearby marshes. And this is a Korea beach in Maine. And this is the beach that I described in Tugged by the Tides, where this is it at high tide, but then this little triangle of land starts forming as the tide goes out. And before you know it, it creates this ephemeral land bridge. Then you can get to the island and explore it, which is, and this is what the island looks like on the other side. It's mostly treeless, a lot of big rocks and boulders. And you better scurry back quickly because you won't get that passage back as the tide comes in. But it's, in some ways, it just looks like a lunar landscape to me. And here, of course, is the monarch caterpillar eating my butterfly weed in my garden. I don't mind when this eats my garden as much as when a porcupine does. And here's the chrysalis that formed that I described in the book. I think it's like a beautiful piece of jewelry in my mind. And this is amazing. What I find amazing is that you can see the wing of the butterfly right before it's about to emerge. It gets dark and translucent. And here's the butterfly coming out and posing because it has to dry its wings for several minutes before it can fly away. And this is a fritillary, another kind of butterfly that comes to my garden a lot. And I have a chapter, I think it's called Springtime, which talks about my discovery of the ephemeral vernal pools basically on the road ditches, how they fill up with water. And then one time we had the good fortune to see the spotted salamander laying her eggs in those ditches. And this is the developing embryos. The spotted salamander is one of the few photosynthetic animals that we have, because it has a symbiotic, their embryos have a symbiotic relationship with algae, such that the algae provide food for the developing embryos. And this is a autumn hawk, they call it. It's a type of dragonfly that was resting on as it migrates south. This was actually taken in November, so it's one of the later ones to head down south. And this is my bay when it's foggy, and I have one chapter on fog, because you have to have a chapter on fog if you spend any time in Maine, right? And how I learned to appreciate the beauty of the fog and how it highlights certain things by obscuring others, and gives me pause and time to think. So that's on my bay, and this is Jordan Pond in the fog. You never see pictures like this sold at the tourist shops, but this was a really beautiful foggy day. And my friend Lynn and I were the only ones walking around, except for a group of very disappointed German tourists. These are I took this in the winter. These are I have a chapter called Winter, which describes how the animals survive the winter. And one of the ways that mice do is they live underneath the snow, which insulates them, and then they create all these little tunnels. And as the snow starts to melt in the spring, they start to become apparent, and that's what this is a picture of. And here's some raccoon paws that etch their way into the snow and ice. And this is Little Moose Island. In my chapter on the geology of Maine called Rock of Ages, I describe these basalt dikes that intrude in the granite. And this is what I described as being a hand that sort of ends looking like a hand. And there's another view of it. This is in the Scudic Park, Vacation National Park. And I have a chapter called Clouds, which is about all the different kinds of clouds that you can see form along the shore, including these lenticular clouds that form on top of mountains, or big, cumulus clouds like these puffy ones here. And I just found them amazing. At first I thought I was seeing a flying saucer. And I'm going to end with this slide. This is a sunrise on my bay, and I think I took it probably around 5 in the morning, because you know how early the sunrise is around here. And when I posted it on Instagram, my friend Becky commented, "No wonder you're up so early. How can you sleep late with such beauty?" And that's about all I have to say. So I'll be selling my books. They're $20 each. You can pay by cash, or I do have a thing that enables you to charge it. And any questions or comments? I always like those. Any thoughts or questions or anything? Yes.
Your writing reminds me of Lindbergh's The Gift.
Oh, Gifts from the Sea, yes. Yeah, she was one of my mentors in terms of just reading her work over and over again. Thank you. That's such an honor to get that compliment.
Yeah. Yeah, she put things together in a poetic way, such as yours.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. You have any questions about how I wrote it or anything? I'm happy to answer. Yeah.
I'm curious about how you research and not get lost in so much research, but pull it back. Can you say a little bit about your process?
Yeah, so some of the chapters required more research than others. So like for Rock of Ages, I read a book about the geology of Acadia National Park. And then I went on multiple websites and also read the roadside geology of Maine. And just, kept on, I spent more time researching probably than writing, and then I sort of narrowed down what I need based on the writing process and what else comes out and what works and what doesn't, and what I feel like I need to explain. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so you probably one of not using so much of your research.
Yes, it gets whittled away. Each of those essays gets rewritten and rewritten and rewritten, and more gets taken away until often I don't figure out what I'm writing about, the purpose of each chapter, until I'm done with a few drafts. And then once I know that, then I go back and whittle and say, well, we don't need to know this information because it's not relevant. Okay, well, nobody else has any questions, I'll sit and sell my books.
Thank you.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you.